Hi, Ricky. Hi, Ricky. I'm muted right here. Hey, Ricky. It might have still been me. My speaker was on, which makes sense because it's pointing to the HDMI. You can. Good. Cool.
Welcome to Denver Modern Web. We host every second Wednesday. Is it second Wednesday? First Wednesday of the month, every month. Thanks for being here. Thank you to Slalom for all the sponsoring, the space, food, etc. And without further ado, I'm going to introduce Tim Hullermann, who's going to talk to us about building awesome software and awesome teams.
Hey, everybody. So thank you, Ricky, and thank you all for coming. I'm excited to talk to you a little bit about my world and the world that I've operated in. I have kind of an interesting path to software development and also a different role than I think many of us in the room. So I'm kind of excited to share some of my experiences around building great teams and what I've seen in my experience as making up great agile delivery teams. I'm also looking forward to some good discussion in terms of some of your guys' experiences with this as well. So we'll cover a couple of things tonight. I want to talk a little bit, kind of at a high level, why are organizations going agile? I think this is a pretty common trend at this point, but there are also times where we don't see it working so well. And we'll talk about that a little bit as we kind of dig a little bit deeper and try to make this meaningful to all of us. We'll talk a little bit about the attributes of successful teams and really dig into what makes a good team, and then ultimately walk through some ideas of how we can contribute to those successful teams and really improve your experience and your team's experience with delivering great software. Because I'm coming at this from kind of a non-technologist perspective, I also want to share some of my experiences and some ideas around how, for those of us that are in different sides of the technology or non-technology spectrum, how can we come together a little bit and work better to deliver successful projects. And I think for those of us that have seen teams work really well and have worked with good product owners or scrum masters or project managers, you've probably seen some of the attributes that make those teams click and make them move well together. So before I go too deep, I wanted to give you guys just a quick introduction to myself. So I'm from Iowa originally. I'll tell you a little bit about my journey, but I studied chemical engineering in college and then immediately became a consultant after that. And I've been in Colorado for the last 8 years or so. This is a picture of my family up here. So my wife, Candace, and the little guy on the left is Max and Nolan. So they are most of my life. This is kind of an old picture, but they grow all the time and always challenge me. I like beer and food. I also like spending a lot of time outside, and big fan of college sports, so go Hawks if anyone is a college football fan. And yes, I still like beer. A fun fact about me is I started consulting right out of college, and I had never actually traveled anywhere on a plane before, my first project. So my first experience traveling somewhere was the first day I started on a consulting project, traveling from Chicago out to Philadelphia. All right. So before we go too far into some of my experiences and some kind of things that we can take away, I did want to open up a discussion with the room here. We've all been on various types of agile delivery projects, and it's not coincidence that I put agile in quotes there. I think that there are a lot of times where we've probably told ourselves, or organizations have told ourselves, that we're operating in an agile manner, but it doesn't always work that well, and I think that there's probably been a lot of good and bad experiences. So I want to open up to the room and hear about some of your guys' experiences, and hopefully we can use that to have a good conversation around some tools and tips and tricks about how we want to, or how we can help our organizations be more successful. So I got a couple of ideas up there around, you may have an experience with your most successful team or your least successful team. I'm also curious, what does being agile mean to you? Does it just mean having a daily stand-up and having a retrospective every 2 weeks, or is there something more there? And then another thing that I always like to hear your guys' thoughts on are, what are attributes of good product owners? So the folks that maybe on a day-to-day basis are interacting with you or your teams and helping drive and provide some of that business context and help us understand what our priorities are. Some are really good, some are not. I bet you've seen both sides of that and would like some feedback. Same with project managers, scrum masters. Curious what you guys have. I see John.
In a situation, I'm working for a small group, and we're all working on the same product, same product. And then the gentleman in charge of the team, we don't have stand-ups, we don't have perspectives, and he just changes priorities kind of on a whim. And so then I asked him if we could have maybe a 5-minute stand-up in the morning, just to working on, because he was stepping on toes. His answer was, we don't do things that way, which is, yeah. And I'm like, well, why not? He's like, because we don't do things that way. And it's like, so we have guys working on the same thing at the same time, and different perspectives. It's definitely an example of not very strong, I think.
Did you feel like you were being listened to when you gave that idea? Kim?
So another ugly is the loudest, most aggressive people at stand-ups get heard, even though they have no experience, they have no knowledge of what they're talking about, and there's no way to get past that. I fight this every time I do an agile meetup. I go, you don't have experience in this, yet you're the loudest, aggressive person, and we have to follow your lead. So it's an ugly thing. I just don't know how to get around it.
Okay. Any other experiences? Chad, what do you have?
I'll give you a good one. I've
Okay.
had several good experiences with Agile, apparently. I'm with a few people in the room. I've seen it work incredibly well, where you have short cycle deliveries and the customer's involved, and the developers have a very direct line to get feedback directly from customers, either through metrics or by talking to them. And the product owner isn't just inventing things out of nothing. The product owner is literally the voice of the customer, or they are the customer. And they need to be a user and using it, eating their own dog food. If you skip that part, Agile falls apart pretty quickly, and it's just a way of delivering the wrong thing faster. It works really, really well in short cycles where you have access to the customer. And once you take that access to the customer out of the picture, it starts to break down pretty quickly. You may as well go to waterfall at that point. That's
We'll talk about that a little.
time and time again, and I've seen it work really, really effectively, and build great products that customers love because the customers are involved at every step of the process.
It's having that feedback loop to, like, to on one degree validate what you're doing and know that the customers are appreciating it.
Loop is not the opinion of the product owner.
Yeah. Oh, for sure. Yeah. And it feels good when you start to see that feedback, even if it's negative sometimes, at least you know, like, that didn't work, now we can go a different direction. We know to change course. Yeah, yep. Chad, you had something?
He was about on the same level, where my experience is when product owners are engaged within the agile process and understand how it works and are able to make those shifts.
Chad, any thoughts on, like, what does it look like when they're engaged in the agile process?
You know, like identifying those the blockers within the Scrum, being able to shift and pivot and help knock down those blockers. See when a project or the ticket is not going well, and trying to maybe do we need to stop, rethink how this is being delivered. Is it MVP? Can we figure out this?
Yep.
Things like that.
Yeah, and back to what Jason said, like having that point or that data to be able to back up some of that direction.
The same thing applies to Scrum Masters. A good Scrum Master will unblock the team and keep them moving forwards, and acts in the interest of keeping the team moving forwards, and removes blocks for the team. Not just straight out blockers, but make sure the team's able to move forward and knows what they're working on. A bad Scrum Master will take minutes of meetings, put Gantt charts together, and ask for timelines and ask for story point updates. You're never going to hit any of that stuff.
Do they understand what you're building?
Most of the time, no. And they don't take the time to. It's all about numbers and moving cards across the board. I've heard one person call Rally or Jira a way of moving story from one iteration to the next. They make sure that things get delivered by enabling the team to move forward. And they can be highly effective or defective, depending on how they approach it.
For sure. Anyone want to take a shot at what being agile means to them or to the teams that they've been on? Yeah.
It is when the customer doesn't fully understand what product they need, yet they know they need it, and you need to deliver it as a development team. And you need to develop it and deliver them a product that works for their customers.
Like that. All right. Well, hopefully we'll be able to touch on a couple of these themes as we keep going through. So again, I want to tell you a little bit about my path because I've had kind of, I think, a unique journey to software development. I haven't been doing Agile forever. Even today, I wouldn't say that the development that I'm directly supporting is really embodying all of the principles of Agile, but I think a big part of what I've learned along the way is to understand that this is a journey and that within any organization, there are kind of steps that you can take toward improving how they operate, building in that feedback loop, making sure that people understand how can we get that, say, feedback from a customer to better inform the work that we're doing. So for me, my path to software development really started back in 2004. I was in college and took basically software development 101 class. We were doing C++ programming and then a little bit of mathematical modeling in MATLAB. So I got kind of my first taste of what you can do with code. Got the hello world, all that out of the way. Realized it was pretty cool. But again, I was studying chemical engineering and kind of just kept moving on after that. Didn't really have a lot of interaction with the software engineering world for a while after that. Fast forward to 2008, I joined Accenture as a analyst with them. And my first project was this massive IT transformation project for a pharma client. And I had a role as a PMO analyst, very functional. I wasn't anywhere close to any developers, but I got a lot of experience at that point working with, I'd say, some of the basic tools that can drive good delivery and help you understand how to make projects and make teams successful. One of the, I think, most poignant things that I learned there was kind of the idea of KPI and data, so your key performance indicators. In this project, we were supporting a rollout of 70,000 new computers to an entire workforce around the world, and we were managing this entire user experience of of learning that you're going to get a new computer, getting that verifying that your applications were going to be on your new computer, getting that delivered to your desk on one day, and then getting a bunch of support after that. So we had this whole workflow tool that would work these users through this process. We developed metrics to basically verify the satisfaction of the users based on survey data, the actual success of the deployments based on defects that were being raised. And I helped develop the metrics and reporting around that. And that was kind of my first endeavor into the area that we were talking about earlier around having that feedback loop to how the customers are doing and what the progress of the team is effectively. So I had a really good experience there. That said, I had no idea what the development teams were doing. I was still pretty far from that. So a couple years later was my first real experience working with developers. And I'll be honest, I didn't know what the hell I was doing. I just said, go help. I was told to go lead this team of 2 people to build another kind of internal facing portal that was supporting the move of about 5,000 employees that were relocating from one site to another, one location to another. We had business people that were telling us what they wanted, and we had developers. And I thought my job at that time was just to understand or hear what the business people wanted and then tell the developers to get it done, and they would just figure it out. I think a big part of my role, and I learned from this, was I need to be a translator. It's not always straightforward what the business or what the customer wants or says they want. There's a big part of that that's really trying to take what they want and then understand what tools we have available to us and how we need to approach that development and being able to turn that into some sort of a workable product. Honestly, I didn't understand that. I thought it was confusing. I thought the developers didn't understand me, and I'm sure they thought the same thing about me. So that was kind of a tough experience. We were able to get through it, but definitely had to step back a little bit and figure out how I was working with development teams. At that point, Agile was not something that I had thought of. So being able to, for example, have a retrospective or some way to proactively get feedback from the team and figure out how we can improve how we're working together was not something that I was doing. So I think we really continued to struggle there for longer than we needed to. So then I kind of moved on to where I'm at right now, working for Slalom. But initially, I did a number of project management roles on larger tech initiatives. Mainly a couple of different clients on a larger merger and acquisition work where we were doing some pretty big system integration and then data migration pieces. So I think at that point, I had kind of developed this understanding that part of my success and part of our team's success was going to be that if I'm in a position to communicate what we're doing and help the business and the executives understand where we're going, I had to be able to understand the actual solution that we were building so that I could speak to that. And when there was an issue or there was a risk, I would understand it and be able to articulate that to the business teams. So I spent a lot more time at that point really working. In this case, it was with some enterprise architects as well as some DBAs around understanding what they were actually doing, how they were building these migration processes, how the ETLs and the system integration was going to look like. And I actually built some collateral that would demonstrate what that was going to be, and then I was able to communicate that to some of the leaders. Inevitably, we had some issues there, and I was able to at least explain, here's why we have this issue. We cannot get connectivity from this system over, in this case, it was the client's IT organization. We can't get connectivity from that system to the legacy system that we were merging. So I got a lot of good experience there, and I think probably gained me a little bit more credibility with the technologists. But it was really hard. We had this whole massive plan that was put in front of us, and it felt kind of like a death march. It was literally a 1.5 year long project that turned into 2 years, and it just never seemed like it was going fast enough. We were so far down a path with the IT organization figuring out this architecture that by the time we finally started looking at how we were going to operationalize it, we realized that it wasn't going to work. And it was very, very painful.
I like the death march part.
I didn't. Yeah. Yeah. So, and I'll say like there, we tried to bring in some of these ideas of Scrum, but it wasn't well executed, and at least for myself, it wasn't something that I had seen in practice really working. So then move along to 2015, 2016. That was my first time really seeing an agile delivery model, Scrum in this case, work really well. And I think it was at a financial services client. We were building a Service Cloud or Salesforce application to support their entire care organization, which was close to 10,000 people. In that case, we had 2 relatively small agile teams that were co-located. They worked very well together, and we had direct access to our customer. We had one product owner who would really serve as the voice of priority and what we needed to focus on. But any time that we needed to get any information in terms of what the customer needed, who were these care team members in a couple of deliveries or care centers around the world, we had them a phone call away. So we really understood the people that we were supporting. When we had any of those discrepancies and should we do this or should we do that, we had a product owner that was willing to help us and set those priorities for us. He also understood the idea of MVP, minimum viable product. We didn't need to boil the ocean for our first release. They had I'd say a very inferior platform for managing all of their call center activities. So he recognized like, hey, we just need to start small and then build upon this. So every time we had a conversation around, what are we actually bringing into the sprint, or when are we going to be able to release that? It was always a very prudent decision-making process where we could decide, do we need this? What's the loss going to be if we can't deliver this in this release? And it allowed us to, within, I think it was 3 months from the time that our team got engaged, we had this new application out there that was already providing a better experience. And then for the next 9 months, we were able to continue to iterate on that and keep building more and more upon the platform that we had provided. That was a great experience to really, with our agile teams, we operated in 2-week sprints. I'll say, went through a lot of the actions, and they actually worked very well, where we went through sprint planning, we had our refinement sessions, we had retrospectives at the end of each one of those, and of course we demoed to the product owner and some of the business teams. It worked really well. Where we struggled a little bit was as we grew and as we wanted to deliver more in less time, it was somewhat difficult to scale that. At the team level, it's very good, and we were in this kind of isolated organization. As they tried to expand the Salesforce platform that we had built outside of that care organization, we ran into some more issues in terms of how would we get that single voice from a product ownership standpoint. How could we get our teams to work together when they were all going to be operating within the same code base? Which brings me to really 2017, 18 and beyond, which is a couple of the guys in the room have been working with me for the last year or two. Much more of a custom development environment where, frankly, the work we're doing and the organization we're in is not fully ready to embrace a lot of these kind of agile and in some cases lean principles. But it's given me a new perspective on how we can actually approach this development, to say it's not about like leaning on the book of Scrum or something like that. It's really more about understanding all the agile principles and why we do certain things, and then helping our teams understand how can we pull from Scrum or pull from Kanban in order to address problems that we're having. An example of that would be that we had a team that was supporting defect fixes and issues in production for a platform that ultimately has about 15 to 20 million customers. And it felt like our priorities were changing every day. We'd try to make a sprint commitment at the beginning of a 2-week time box. And on day 2, we would have new priorities coming in because there was some sort of customer impacting issue that had been identified, or or something else. One of the things that we adopted there was to move from more of a Scrum-based model to Kanban, where we'd have more flexibility to adjust our priorities on the fly, and whatever would sift to the back of the top of the backlog on any given day would allow the team to react accordingly without totally turning a sprint upside down. Any questions? Okay. All right. So before we go into kind of the team and individual level here, I do want to talk a little bit about why do organizations go agile. You can see a lot of the different frameworks and everything here at the right. Lots of reasons. I'll go through these pretty quickly, but one of the biggest things is being able to adapt to a changing environment, which ultimately should lead you to greater quality. So I'll keep going back to that feedback loop. In Agile, as opposed to Waterfall, it allows you to develop small chunks of customer value, oftentimes in these 1 or 2 or 4 week time boxes. And hopefully you start getting feedback from your customer very, very quickly. In doing so, you quickly identify issues. You quickly identify maybe where something that you thought was going to make a lot of sense to your customer, maybe it's not. And in that case, you can improve and you can shift course, pivot. So that's where you also build in some of that quality, because you're always getting that feedback loop, not only through testers and things like that, but through your actual customers. Kind of in the same vein, if we want to compare Agile development to Waterfall, Waterfall, oftentimes you take 6 months to figure out your requirements, and then another 6 months to develop them, and then another 3 months to test it, and then another month to actually get it to your customers. And by that time, I can't do math, but it's 1.5 years later, and whatever you actually thought your customers wanted isn't what they needed, and you've lost that 1.5 years. With Agile development, hopefully you're releasing much more frequently, and that's one of the principles behind the Agile Manifesto. It allows you to quickly realize some of that value and also decrease your risk. Maybe you deliver something that the customers don't like. It's all right. You spent 2 weeks working on that, and now you can pivot, and you don't have this year-long effort that is all lost.
Tim?
Mm-hmm.
From my experience, both in Agile and Waterfall, success relies on quality of the requirements.
Mm-hmm.
Can you speak to that?
What are you looking for?
You made this somewhat pejorative statement that Waterfall takes 1.5 years to get at.
Mm-hmm.
I haven't found out it's always been that way. Particularly if you have good requirements, you think ahead, have a really good analyst.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't have to take that long.
Yep.
So I think that I think you're absolutely right in terms of what Agile gives you is the ability to get instant feedback on what you're building right away.
Mhm.
It's huge. But I think that it's a bit of a stretch saying that Waterfall is going to take 1.5 years and then you get results in 2 weeks from Agile.
Yeah, and I mean, I think I see what you're saying, John, where with Waterfall, one of the advantages or the ideas behind it is that you put a lot of thought into those requirements so that by the time you actually develop something, it's going to be the right thing because you put so much thought into that. And I think sometimes that works, but you're investing a lot there, and you're kind of taking a risk that whether it's 1.5 years or 7 months, whatever else, that you're taking a gamble and you hope that it works. In Agile development, whether it's 2 weeks or 2 months, you're spending less upfront investment, and even if you fail, hopefully you're failing fast, and the loss there is not as great.
I've written a 130-page requirements document in a month. I've seen analysts write requirements in a waterfall style in 2 weeks. So I've seen that work. I don't think it's that waterfall is slow in 6 months every time.
Mm-hmm.
I think everyone goes straight to waterfall 6 months and do 6 months of upfront design because everyone heard healthcare.gov. They're not all like that. I've seen good analysts write requirements really quickly. For multiple years in the telco industry, like they do it really, really well. And that's an industry where you can't get access to the customer.
See, I disagree,
Yep.
because like you can do PowerPoints and wireframes all you want to, yet I actually go
Mm-hmm.
not a wireframe, but an actual app, and they say, well, we don't like this, we need you to do this button. If they have a wireframe, they don't have anything.
Yep.
So that's my argument, is I just don't see the, I just get so angry when like, people like come to me and say, we want you to wireframe this. Why would I do that?
I recall working my first project for GTE, and ever since that point, I mean, I gave these books, these binders, I opened it up, and every question that I could have asked, it was answered. And the development is super, super quick. And then I don't, and it's a matter of, obviously, requirements gathering, and it's not easy to gather clear detailed requirements, to keep asking questions. But those guys were awesome. And I think the department, and they're like, well, what do you think about this? Or what about this? What about this? So it's just,
I mean, but sometimes you don't know what the requirements are.
Exactly.
That's where like Agile's like, I don't know what product I'm supposed to build. I know I need something to solve the problem, but until I start building something, I have no idea what that is.
Yep. And I do think there can be a place for both of these, and it's not to say that one is necessarily better than the other. I might be a little biased, but yeah, at the end of the day, I think there are times that either one of those approaches can work.
I'm not forgetting either things. I'm not forgetting having really good requirements.
Yeah. I think at the end of the day, like being thoughtful in terms of what you're building and what requirements or acceptance criteria you're putting out there is very important. Agile gives you a little bit more of those short increments in order to be able to quickly change course if you find out that an assumption that you made is not actually true.
But see, you don't understand, like, when you do like a mobile app,
Mhm.
to get things into the Play Store or iTunes, you need actually something. You can't put a wireframe into iTunes. You have to have a piece of code that actually does a splash frame.
Yep.
And I keep telling my customers this, that the amount of time it takes to get through this process, you need a DUNS, you need, all this stuff to get through this. You need 6 months, and they don't agree with me. And I keep telling them, it's like, don't do wireframes, put something out there.
Yep.
Apple is not, Apple can be
Yeah.
tough.
And part of it goes, yeah.
I mean, you gotta put something in the stores, and you gotta have something that passes their test. And that's why, like, a prototype app over a wireframe is so much better.
Yep, and we'll talk about a little bit of that as we talk about how we can kind of change that mindset. So I'm going to keep moving. Another reason is going agile, and particularly for adopting a framework, whether it's something that you develop in-house, say for a large organization that understands maybe unique needs that they have that one of the out-of-the-box frameworks doesn't have, but it allows you to adopt a common language. So I'll use an example here at Slalom. We have our own product engineering methodology. We call it PEM. I don't know how familiar everyone is with kind of the model that Slalom operates in, but we've got multiple offices around the country and around the world, and we're supported by a cross-market team of mostly engineering talent that supports across all those offices. We need to have a way that when we scale, say on a large engagement here in Denver, that we can bring in folks from our cross-market team to support whatever scale that our customer is looking for. So part of that is having our engineering methodology so that when we bring in one of these cross-market teams, maybe I've never worked with that team before, but we're going to talk the same language. We have the same kind of phases of our development. We've got the same roles. So when I talk about a solution owner or a solution architect or engineer, we all are thinking of the same thing. We understand what role that person plays on a team, and there's no confusion. It helps us hit the ground running really quickly, and has allowed us to scale to much bigger than what you might see sitting in this room or this office. Which leads me to scalability. Obviously, some of these frameworks, I'll call out SAFe or Scrum at Scale, are really designed to take what is oftentimes easier at a smaller team level and build that into a large organization that's maybe supporting a number of interconnected products or multiple development teams supporting the same product. There are ideas on how you can run this, and a lot of companies need to turn to something like that in order to make sure that they're successful. And as an example right now, that like Ricky and Nick and Dave, a number of us have been working on, is our current client. They have grown 4 or 5-fold based on a merger. And what used to be a single team supporting a single application has probably quintupled in size because they've got that many greater demands from the customer. They turned to SAFe as a way to help them scale and kind of build a common language without having to reinvent the wheel. So it's very, very, very important to us. Should we go agile just because everyone's doing it? I don't think so. All right, so let's talk about teams a little bit. So I think we all have our own idea of what good teams are, and I'll kind of run into these, and I want to hear what you guys think. But from my experience, at the top of the list for the best teams is that we've got a shared purpose. I guess the example I'll use is actually an instance where we have not had a shared purpose. That same team I mentioned earlier that was primarily focused on working on defect support that would kind of come out of the blue from customers in production. Because it was such a large application, there was no shortage of defects or issues for them to address. That team, I think, had the right mentality, but we really struggled to get excited about the work and to form like a real positive team environment because we didn't have a shared purpose. On any given day, we'd have 4 team members, and one would be working on this defect, and the next one would be working on that defect in a totally different area of the application. And the next day, it would all swap. We're all over the place. We weren't building something that we could all share in kind of the enjoyment and that win of delivering something that we could see our customers realizing value. We were just pecking away at small defects. On the flip side, I've worked on teams where, if I use that care application I mentioned earlier, we have an entire team that had a very set kind of scope to build a care application to support those customer service reps. Everyone had a role there. We had, because it was Salesforce, we had the configuration experts, and we had our Lightning developers. But we all knew what we were doing. We had a clear backlog. We had clear priorities. And we knew that we were working toward a goal to go live with this thing by June of that year. That team was happy. They were always looking for the next thing. And we also had that direct contact with our customers, so it was pretty easy to see the value that we were providing. Another one is communication. And this is 2 ways, or in 2 different lights. One of them is to communicate within the team. I think sometimes it's easy to go into a sprint planning if you're doing Scrum and say, oh, here's my mission because you pick up this ticket after sprint planning, and go in your hole and work on that. That's not always good because somebody on your team might be working on the same thing, or they might have something to offer that can help you. I always like to see co-located teams, or if you're not co-located, then teams that find ways to be able to communicate virtually, whether it's via Hangouts or something like that. So always communicate within your team. Don't assume that someone else in your team knows what you're doing or that you're doing it the right way. Always take input. And the other piece is really to communicate more outwardly. I think it's very easy to kind of operate in our bubble as development teams. But at the end of the day, you've got a lot of great resources out there, and in some cases you may need external input. One example right now, I'm going to call it the work that Nick is doing. We have a team that is, based on our current model, we have separate front-end and back-end development teams. Our front-end team ran into some issues a month or 2 ago where we didn't have we ran into an issue effectively with how the back-end and the front-end were integrating. And while we could have probably taken a route to communicate with the back-end team, here's the challenge that we've got, and try to work with them together to solution the best approach to figure that out, we kind of kept that within ourselves and came up with a great solution that our team could own and manage, which is ironic because we've got take ownership next. But at the end of the day, that was probably a time to communicate with that back-end team and figure out collectively between front-end and back-end what was the best approach to deal with that problem. That said, take ownership. I think one of the downfalls sometimes in large organizations in particular is that you end up in this spot where it feels like everything's dictated to you, And I think there's a time to actually take back some of that ownership and understand the product that you're building and understand that you are the expert there, and work with your product owner, with whoever it may be, to really represent your product and be the voice that says, here's how we want to take this, or here's how we need to approach this. Challenging and taking risks, that fits right with the taking ownership part. I think it's always important to understand that just because somebody has given you some sort of guidance doesn't always mean that there's not a better way. And I think to remember that, as development teams, we are often the experts. We know what we're building better than anybody else. I love to see teams that are willing to say, hey, I know you asked for this, but I've got that. I think that's a huge one. And then welcome the diverse expertise. I'll use an example of the measurement. We talked about that a little bit earlier. Right now, in a lot of the work that I've been doing, we've kind of treated some of our analytics and measurement of what we're doing as, I don't want to call it an afterthought, but it's not always informing the work that we're doing. One of the things that the organization that I'm supporting is moving toward is really to make that analytics and that data a first-class citizen, welcoming that as kind of a new way to think about how we do development, and informing the actual customer problems that we're going out to solve based on the data that we're seeing from those customers. The best teams do not fear failure. I think we already hit on this a little bit, but it's good to take risks. It's okay to fail. And I think for a lot of leadership and everything to really recognize that failure is okay. Hopefully we're able to learn from our mistakes or learn from our quote unquote failures and do something better the next time. And then the last two there, never stagnate, never accept mediocrity. Teams that are excited about what they're doing and understand what their customer is doing or what their customer wants, I think are always looking for that next thing because they know what that problem is. They know how they can help the customer, and they're not going to just sit there and say, well, that's good enough. They can do everything they need to do. They want to make that the best experience possible. They want to make sure that it's not just a good enough tool, but it's the best. It's a lot of talking from me. Any other feedback or any other thoughts that you guys have seen that really make up a good team? I would say underpinning all these is the concept of trust, right? So within the team and then outside the team. Doing it from a development perspective, I think it's easy to have the I know what's best mindset, but from a product owner perspective.
Mm-hmm.
That's not the case. But then also, that everyone on your team has a valid perspective, and I think that plays back into welcoming diverse expertise. While someone may not be as senior, right? That doesn't mean their opinion is invalid, or while management is asking for something, or believe something to be a certain way, it doesn't necessarily mean it's invalid. But how can we trust each other in a way that allows us to build a really cool, awesome product? And ultimately challenge and take risks and do all those other things you have listed. Agreed. Anything else? I know it's kind of small, but teamwork is the ability to work as a group toward a common vision, even if said vision becomes extremely blurry. I feel that way sometimes, but one thing that I'll do, and I would encourage all of you to do, is also to challenge that sometimes. And if you feel like you're losing sight of the goal or your team is losing sight of the goal, reset, figure out what that goal is, call it out. I think every so often you need a little bit of a shakeup to remind yourself, what are we here for? And are we here to hit a date, or are we here to actually deliver some sort of value for our customer? And sometimes that gets lost in kind of the shuffle of all this, and it's okay to step back and ask for that reset or that new perspective. All right, so how can you help? I try to break this into kind of two sides. I'm coming at this from the perspective of a non-technologist and how I've found that I can be successful. I also know that we have a lot of people who are technologists here and probably are looking, how can we all better work together? The thing before I go into any of this, though, is I want to call out, we should all be able to think in many different ways, and hopefully every one of us can do all these different things up here. if we're all doing these together, that's when you have the most successful teams, and there really is a spot for all of that. As a technologist, I think first and foremost, understand your business. I think sometimes it's easy to get caught up in kind of the day-to-day of I have to deliver this user story, and there's this one thing right here, this acceptance criteria that says I have to do this. If we want to be able to challenge or take ownership of the tool that we're building, we should understand like how are we serving our customers. And you can do this lots of ways. We talked a little bit about using data and metrics to understand what our customers are looking for and what's important to our customers. Sometimes it might be direct contact with customers if possible, or at least via a product owner to understand what those customers are looking for, which then allows you to take ownership of your product. Communicate openly and often. This is my favorite one, is just communication, communication, communication. I think it's really easy in teams to just make assumptions and say, well, like this is the right way because it's the way I know, or it's what I was told to do. I think that we always have an opportunity to share what we're doing and to ask questions if we feel like maybe it's not quite right. Don't assume that everyone knows exactly what's going on in your head, or that because somebody said one thing that they're so set on that. Talk, ask questions. Educate everyone. This is another good one, and something that like personally I really value, and I think that as you look at successful product owners or solution owners, scrum masters, whatever, hopefully they're asking and they're listening and you're ready to educate. I think one of the most important things for me to do to be successful is to listen and to understand the product that the teams that I'm working on are building. That's where I see scrum masters and product owners go wrong, is they're just like, I'm here to tell you what to do, and then I'm going to step away and let you do it. If I can't understand what you're doing, and if you don't want to go as far to teach me what you're doing, then we're never going to be able to communicate what we're doing to the business. So open up your world as a technologist to others, and I think that you'll find that there's a lot of good that can come from that. Provide options. Hardest thing for me to hear is, oh, that thing that we plan to do, we're not going to be able to do. Sorry. But if you come with an option and say, you know, we talked about this, and that's not going to be possible, but here are 2 ways we can go. Even if you know that like one way is kind of the right way or the only option, it's very helpful to hear that like here is an alternative way that we could address this problem, and we won't have to, or we have a choice in this, we have a say in this. It kind of brings everyone along with you. So if you're working with one of your product owners maybe, and you know what we originally agreed to deliver or what we thought was going to be an acceptance criteria isn't so possible, come back with options. Don't just say I can't do it. Say, well, I can't do this, but I can do that, or I can do that. And then embracing change and leading it from within. Agile methodologies are normally pretty good with that, where they allow us to adapt our priorities on a pretty regular basis, whether it's after 2-week time boxes, whatever else. I think we all have to know that it's a pretty dynamic world, and your priorities are going to change. What you think today is going to be different in 2 weeks. So embrace it, but I think most importantly is recognizing that we don't have to always stay on this course. And I think that's the hardest thing, is we get set in this way where there's a plan that's in front of us and we're afraid to say, let's actually turn right instead of going straight. So for non-technologists, quickly go through these. Teach the why and the what will emerge. So many times I've seen, and frankly I've been guilty of, just saying, okay, we're doing Scrum, so we're going to have these Agile ceremonies and say that we're operating agilely. And that's not how it works. We should understand that why we're doing these activities. And example of refinement. It's not that we're trying to document every single business requirement that ever existed. It's that we're trying to understand with our team and with our product owner, what are we handshaking on to deliver as part of this user story, and we'll figure the rest out later. And maybe for one team, that's something that happens organically via hallway conversations. In another team, it's a meeting every Tuesday afternoon. I don't think we need to hold ourselves to like such a rigid structure, but we need to understand like what goals are we trying to achieve and why, and then the team can figure out like what the best way to achieve those goals is. We've already had a lot of understanding the solution, but I talked a little bit, I think early on, about being a translator. I've served Scrum Master roles as well as within Slalom what we have as a solution owner role. If I don't understand the solution or the kind of technical implementation of what we're doing, I'm not going to be able to communicate that to our executives or as a consultant to the clients who are expecting to understand what we're delivering and when, and if an issue comes up, why that came up. So my goal is to work with the development team, with the architects to understand, beyond the surface level, what are we doing and why, and what challenges do we expect to have, so that if I get challenged or they get challenged, I can help protect them. And it goes back to that, like, getting everyone else out of the way so the team can just do the job. If I'm not able to understand what the team is doing, how can I protect them? So I think for those of us that are probably more focused on the technology side, reminder, educate, 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 and hopefully you've got somebody who wants to understand that solution. And if they do, they'll be able to help you. Yep.
So I totally agree with that because like I'm working with customers now, and if they understand the solution of what they need and it costs, I show them what it will cost them to put this on Amazon and their growth pattern, and like you're not going to make any dollars in the next 2 years or 3 years or 5 years. So I totally agree with that. Understand the solution because the solution is you're going to lose money. And you need to tell the customer that.
Right, and if you bring them along with you, like to understand, here's what I'm up against, or here's how this model works, yeah, agreed. I already talked a little bit about ask, listen, repeat. I'm not very good at the listen part sometimes, but I try to ask, I do try to listen, and in order to understand the solution, you have to be able to ask and listen, and then keep asking. And if you do that, you're going to be in a much better spot with your team. Get out of the way. I think somebody hit on this earlier, but I think that especially if you look back to more traditional or waterfall environments where typically you build this massive plan and then you've got somebody whose job it is, a project manager, to track to that plan. In an agile world and a lot of the stuff that we're talking about, that's not the best way. You need to trust the team. Nick, I think that was you that said that. To understand what the work is, give them the support that they're going to need to be able to deliver the best work to their customer, and then get the hell out of the way. There's no reason they need you to remind them of their sprint commitment, because hopefully they built that commitment on their own and that they're excited to deliver on that and motivated to deliver on that because it's their goal, not the goal that you put in front of them. Knowing when to challenge and when to protect is a good one and a tough one. So if you understand that solution, hopefully you're in a position that at some point you can challenge the team a little bit and say like, hey, I know that you're trying to go after this. We want to refactor everything that we're doing in order to make it just so perfect. But maybe what we already have for our solution is good enough. And from the business perspective, we understand that it's not worth taking 4 weeks to go rebuild this area of our code base so that it's incrementally better. But there's also times you have to know when to protect the team, when maybe we've learned something drastically new that 2 weeks ago we didn't know, and we have to go through that refactor. And that might not sit well with some of our business people to understand that we're going to spend 2 weeks just making things better behind the scenes. But if we understand that solution well enough, we should be in a better position to communicate, here's why we're doing this refactor, and really let the team go after that while you communicate the reasoning to the business team. And then the last one, foster environment for continuous improvement. And I think that this is a important one. There's some kind of mechanical things that we can all do, and just in terms of making sure that we have those feedback loops, both from the customer in terms of understanding the product and how they're using it, but also within the team, and having those retrospectives, understanding what's working, what's not, how can we change how we're working. So many of these, to me at least, get tied up together where if you get out of the way and trust the team, they're going to feel comfortable always providing new ideas and admitting maybe when, hey, we made that gamble this week or on this feature. It didn't work, but we learned something, and now we're going to go a different route. If every time the team tries to make a change or tries to take a risk, they get their hand slapped for it, they're not going to want to take risks anymore, and now we're going to slow down the ability that we can change and adapt. Any other ideas in terms of how we can kind of better bridge that gap between technologists and non-technologists? Okay. Yeah, let's hear it.
Not spend 80% of the meeting talking about what a story point is worth. just to be honest for those of you who've worked in a story point driven environment.
And I think that's where it goes back to the what versus the why. We can get really hung up on how are we story pointing, or we can say, do we know what we have to do here, and just move on and get shit done. Nick, you were talking about that today, right?
100%. For an hour and a half.
Yep. Anything else?
Maybe talk about what the concept of a story point is.
At the end, if somebody wants to grab a beer with me, I can talk about story points, but I'm not going to dig in too deep here. Okay, Chad, it's the E right there. All right, so there's a lot of words up here. I'll quickly kind of run over these, but I want to acknowledge that this isn't always easy, and that you can go read the internet all day about how great Agile is and about how every organization should be Agile and why it's going to be great. But every day I see areas where we're falling down, and I bet you guys have even more examples. So as kind of a takeaway here and some kind of meaningful things that we can do in order to address common pitfalls, I've got, 5 or 6 items up here, but again, like to hear you guys' take. So if you're doing this, something wrong presumably, then you can try this. So if you're scheduling Scrum events and telling yourself that you're Agile, don't fool yourself. I think where it's more important to remember is you've got an Agile manifesto and principles that it was based upon, most of which we've touched on here, and it's things about putting the customer first, having relatively short iterations to be able to develop some measure of value and then iterate on it, hopefully releasing to your customers frequently so that you can get that feedback. It's a lot of those things that are with the manifesto is more around focusing on the customer and focusing on this lightweight approach to development without letting some of the things like documentation get in the way. Probably my single biggest pain point, at least right now, is around structuring teams by function as opposed to structuring them by value. So a lot of organizations, especially maybe longer running organizations that used to operate in a more waterfall manner, tend to have their entire organizational structure based on a function like product or testing or DevOps. And then what that starts to look like is all these little mini Agile teams that have waterfall handoffs to each other. And that's not operating agilely. And within any one of those teams, maybe they pretend they're Agile, but you still have to hand off each step of the way. So try structuring them by value instead. If you're a cable company who provides an application to watch video, another application to get customer support, rather than having a development team for video and a development team for support and a test team for video and a test team for support, have a support team and have a video team. And each one of those, make sure that you've got those development and test and DevOps capabilities built within that team.
I'm sorry, so you say you don't like those 3 structures? Because I like those 3 structures because I'm dead and I'm sloppy and I need that to catch my problems and I need product to actually give me my feedback from the customer. So are you saying you don't like those 3 structures? Because I like those 3 structures.
I think he's referencing the concept of like a full stack team as opposed to specific product dev tests, right, where they all have their own individual silos and there's like enough between each. You still have the
I like the silos.
You
They
still
catch my mistake.
well, you said and like
They give a better, I think they give a better product to the customer. Maybe I'm wrong.
I think you still have, and correct me if I'm wrong.
Mm-hmm. There's not necessarily a right or wrong answer, but I think you're going the same spot I would, yeah.
The same
and those things still happen, but they're happening within the set of a single value or value stream. So everyone's aligned around what you're delivering and how you're delivering it. Instead of me operating as a product team today or this week and working on something, and then next week throwing it over to you as a developer for you to try to develop it, and then the week later throwing it over to Chad to test it, I want you and me and Chad to all sit right here and figure out what we're going to work on together. And then as you start developing it and you've got a question about, well, what does that mean, or how am I going to handle this? You bring Chad and me together, and I can give you my perspective, and Chad's going to say how he's going to validate that. But we'll still have those capabilities. I'm not saying we shouldn't have a product voice or testing or development. Put them on the same team. Make sure that they're all getting exactly the same direction and guidance, rather than having a set of test priorities that conflict with a set of development priorities that conflict with a set of product priorities.
So just to break it down into another analogy, would it be like going from a baton race to more like a bobsled team?
I love it. I'm going to take that. Yeah. Yeah. Well said. Seriously, I'm going to take that. Yeah, that's good.
That is, I love that. That's cool.
Take a good example. So we were trying to get to the end of the sprint, and my tester came to me as the lead with a story that he thought meant one thing. And as we started, and I was trying to explain, no, I think it means, this is what I perceive the story to be. As we started diving into it, we realized that the understanding of what the story meant two different things between two different people. So since our product owner and in fact our scrum master were both right there, we were able to have a powwow and within 5-10 minutes understand what the definition of the story was, go back, redevelop, re-architect, and pass through testing within a matter of a day.
Well said.
Because we were in the same place, same function, the same team.
Any other questions on that one? This is probably one of the hardest ones to crack. Like, I'll be honest, like one of us isn't going to walk in there and just like reorganize an entire company to organize around value instead of function. But it's certainly something that we can work toward in terms of building teams that have all of these capabilities within the same team that is, working in the same cadence, working toward the same goals. It's something that we all can strive for and make sure that we're advocating for within the groups that we're working with. So next up, calling a BRD, that's like a business requirement document, kind of throwback to old school days of like building all your requirements up front. Calling that a user story. If you haven't heard of INVEST before, it's independent, negotiable, valuable, estimable, small, testable stories. These should be things that, regardless of like which framework you're working in, a team can pick up in a relatively short amount of time, call it a week or two, be able to complete end to end, and at the end of it have something that they can demonstrate is going to be valuable to a customer, and it's going to be testable. And while we're not going to go into estimating right now, the team can give some sort of indication in terms of what do we think the complexity to deliver this user story is. Any questions on user stories? Okay. Treating agile transformation as an event. It is very much a journey. No one just like flips a switch and is like, we're agile. Goes back to that first one. Like, just because you have a daily stand-up does not make you an agile team. Probably much the opposite. You need to understand that it's all about kind of understanding and living these principles, and sometimes you have to do things like change your organization before you can fully start operating in that way. So look at it as a path, and if you're not continuously experimenting and trying new things and continuing to work toward delivering that software more quickly to your customers and creating that feedback loop and getting it shorter and shorter, you've still got work to do. And then the last one, which is a whole nother can of worms, is struggling to go from kind of team level success to enterprise level wins. Agile, in its simplest form, really is looking at small teams and how they can be successful. It's a lot harder when you've got an organization of 500 people that's all trying to support maybe that same product or that same value stream. So lots of things that you can do. There are frameworks out there that you can lean upon. SAFe being kind of the industry leader, Scaled Agile framework. Invest in learning and training. I think that's an important one in terms of like having alignment between all these teams. If they're all expected to go figure it out themselves, they're all going to figure out something different, and that might be good for each one of those individual teams. But if they're not speaking that common language that we talked about earlier, there's going to be mass confusion across your teams. So you really have to invest in some of that. Another thing to think about is how do you limit those dependencies? I mentioned earlier that the teams that I'm working with right now have separate front-end and back-end teams. What that means for software development is that almost everything we build has a dependency on someone else. Every little user story you've got depends on somebody else to implement some sort of back-end functionality before you can actually build the front end on top of that. Sometimes it's a necessary evil, but always striving to build those teams that really are full stack and that have all those capabilities built within the team. It's a lot easier to have two people that are on the same bobsled team, front end and back end, work together to deliver that than to wait for one bobsled to get on the track, or well, I'm trying to figure out the analogy. Hand off from one to the other. It's going to take longer that way than just pushing together. Yep. I like it. All right. And remember those 12 principles. What other like pitfalls or issues have you seen with teams that you've worked on? Anything else? Anything?
What about bringing novices that still need a lot of support to develop their skills? How do you bring them in without restricting the other people that still need to get their work done?
It's a great question, and I bet a lot of people around here might have ideas. A couple things I can say is that anytime you're adding like new people to a team, regardless of their skill level or experience, are probably going to have a negative impact on the team's output for a period of time, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it's something to consider that you're changing that team dynamic at that point. And even if you've got the most experienced team member who's got all these skills, there's still going to be nuances of how that team or that organization operate. And it's going to take some time from other people on the team to onboard that individual. So I'll say from my perspective, as somebody who's maybe predicting the team's capacity and figuring out what we can deliver within some sort of a time box, I don't care how great that person is, I'm going to communicate like, hey, we're going to take a temporary hit in our velocity. It's going to maybe slow down our immediate delivery. And then hopefully over time we'll recover that because we'll have additional support. I would probably tend to find a mature team that has fairly stable, that's going to have somebody or some buddies on that team that can help bring along that new person. But I'll invite the room to give me your feedback on.
Well, my feedback is new people are not the problem. It's the curmudgeons that have the 20-year job experience and subversion that don't actually want to adopt anything that you are telling them to do, which is a customer, which I've had so many problems with customers that have ancient technology ideas. You must have seen this, ancient technology ideas. How do you change their ideas to adopt things that are fast and working? And I can't get, on some of my customers that can't adopt ideas that are workable in this environment.
Yeah, I mean,
You must see that with some of your enterprise customers, these smart CTOs who have 20 years of Java enterprise experience who won't adopt any of your ideas that you're trying to put forth into their companies.
everyone kind of accepts change at a different rate.
They don't accept change. They just fight you every step in battle.
Yep.
No matter what you do. So.
I mean, I probably, from my perspective, point back to kind of the why. Hopefully there's a reason that change is coming, and it's not just like being forced on them, but we can help them understand like how they're going to benefit from that. And again, the pace of change or acceptance of change is going to be different for everybody. But I think it is trying to kind of meet everyone where they're at and then help them understand, here's why we're bringing about this change. It's not always easy. Do Do we answer your question?
Not
I think one of the things,
explicitly yet.
I think one of the things that you were asking, and from what I've seen, specific like team roles, is that what you were doing? Was that, I mean, I think it's super important to have someone sit with product and day one, right? Let product say, here's the why, and why the customer wants it, why the customer needs it, and this is how we're responding to it. And then depending on the role, you can work them in from a less impactful position. So like maybe they're a dev, but you have them sit at the test and shut a test as test is pushing through things, right? So they understand some of the work that's been going on and what is coming out the other end before you work them on into the part with that. I mean, it does take a velocity hit. That's always part of it, but I mean, I think there are ways to make that less impactful. That's what I've done in the past. That answers your question.
Well, I'm thinking of if you have them with a group of developers that everybody is kind of working on something, not necessarily everything being the same, but they have multiple people to work with, rather than in a team where it's probably more lean, where you only have maybe one or two people working on each function. There's less opportunity maybe to ask those questions or to get a diverse amount of training or assistance. That's kind of where I'm going.
Are you saying if you're in like maybe a smaller organization where somebody's coming in without a lot of like domain knowledge or people that can help them with domain knowledge and whatever they're going to be supporting, how do you like upskill them to the point that they can support that area?
Yeah, I know it's a dirty word, but how do you train people?
Ricky, can I put you on the spot a little bit? Like, you've spent a lot of time on our current work, onboarding new people and trying to bring them into a pretty large, complex code base. Do you have any feedback from your side in terms of how you brought people up?
The principles are make sure they understand the why, give them space to make mistakes. That's perfectly okay. Encourage mistakes. And the third thing is remove barriers. And when I say barriers, it's in terms of talking with fellow team members. Like I hate spaces. So it's a slight tangent. I hate companies that have an open space and then go, you guys are too loud. But it's about taking them or helping them understand the sources of information and how to get to them and how to get around bureaucracy and so forth. So those are kind of like the three things I make sure I follow. And I found that once I do that, the rest kind of come along.
The maybe only thing that I haven't heard mentioned. Oh, go ahead, Chad.
I was going to say, it also sounds like you guys are working in a state of overcommitment every single sprint. If you don't have that time to have the communication and the training, the time to handle the barriers, then when you do bring in that new person, if you're already at 100% commitment, how are you going to handle the extra 10%, the extra 20%?
That is true. Are you in a situation where they're like, so you went from 3 to 4 devs, increase your velocity by 30%, or 25, or whatever that number is? If that's the situation you're in.
The mythical man month. Yeah.
You need a baseball bat and break some knees.
And hopefully you've got people that are supporting you and understanding that adding more people doesn't always help you scale your output like proportionally. Just because you went from 3 to 4 people doesn't mean that you just got 33% more velocity. Initially, we've already talked about, it's going to go down. And even over time, there's probably the law of diminishing returns. And you know, like every team dynamic is going to change as you add new people. And the bigger you are, oftentimes the less efficient you'll be. The one thing that I thought of that I don't think we hit on is just you're adding new people to a team. Like by the book training or like trying to talk to somebody about whatever code base they're supporting isn't going to go that far. Sometimes you need a real problem or a real opportunity to go out and just figure it out. And you need to be able to fail and have that safe environment. But until you've got like something to do to actually go hands on keyboard, I think it's hard to really learn. And you know, the textbook exercise only gets you so far. So give them a real problem to solve and then give them the support when they ultimately need it.
When I'm thinking of kids coming out of college, they know a lot,
Mm-hmm.
but they can't do a lot. So how do you actually get them ramped up in an environment where there might be, because we're no longer operating with a large group, like everybody doing the same kind of thing, how do we still structure that so that they have opportunities to reach out to different people or different resources? I guess that's kind of where, I don't know if that's, the organization needs to be, and I think sometimes the organizations are afraid of taking people on because of that. Because their training has become a dirty word.
Mm-hmm.
And it's, if you don't come with the skills already, we don't want you kind of mentality.
Yeah, tough one to answer. I mean, I think that at the end of the day, like oftentimes you want to find an organization that has that mix of, especially for maybe fresh people out of school, something like that, where they're not totally off on their own. They've got people more experienced that they can pair with and learn from. Whereas maybe it's a smaller organization with very small team, you might be looking for somebody who's got more of that breadth of experience that they can always pull from. So whatever solution or whatever problem hits them, they're going to be able to help solution it. Yeah, I don't know if I'm answering your question, but it is tough.
There
Yeah.
isn't an easy way to answer
Nope.
it, so.
But this is where I think Agile actually allows for that, as opposed to, not to go back to like traditional waterfall versus Agile, but a teaming concept, right, where there's a joint ownership of delivered outcome. And if you fail, then you fail. If you fail quickly and you learn from your mistakes and you adapt your approach and either take that into your current sprint work or carry that over to the next, but it's that joint ownership. So some of that, while an individual I think learns or should be learning from failure, they're also, the team plays a role collectively, I think, in coaching that individual on the right path. And there are, I've seen, like we talked about, there are people that come out of college that aren't, that don't respond well to that because it's not specific. Read this, do this, receive an A, right? It is fail, learn, and go. But I think teams play such an important part in that, where you have people coaching in small ways, or doing code reviews, or whatever it might be, to help the individual along, but also contributing to the outcome of the overall team. Does that make, I don't know. And I'm not a technologist either, so that's.
I think you're starting to dive into deeper things too. So
Sure.
when you say like code review, like peer code reviews,
Yep.
really strong if everybody, and if there's a whole team does, everybody can participate.
Exactly.
And when you have that one person, even if they're your strongest coder not participating, then like you're never learning.
Right.
You know,
Yep.
I mean, what we're doing brown bags for people, what we're doing pair programming, we've done, you know, small steps, like here's a simple bug, and then, okay, I'm tired of the bugs, okay, here's a full-blown feature,
Right.
you know, and then, oh, I'm not having trouble, okay, let's step in, help. I think another aspect that's a little overlooked is when you do bring in some of those new junior people, other people's velocities are going to go down too because of that, and we never account for that.
And I would even argue not just junior people.
So,
Like,
you know, I mean,
anyone,
yeah.
right?
Yep.
And that's where I'm going back to like the overcommitment. If everybody's at 100% and nobody has time for that new person, then that new person never has an opportunity to succeed.
For sure.
I'd say one of the obvious things I think I've seen improve the odds is bringing them in as a cohort. Basically hiring 3 junior devs at the same time. And then start them off together, move them around whenever. But like the people you start with, you remember. And that helps you kind of build your connection and your network off the bat while being safe.
Is it good to have that, say, cohort working on the same problem together, or if you're in a large organization, is it actually good to let them scatter but still have that connection between each other when they?
It's good to start them off together
Mhm.
because I think that builds your first
Although I'm a proponent for mix the teams up after a while.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think mixing the teams up after a while is good. I think just creating that safe environment initially, where like they have something that they can run to when they have a shitty day, is vitally important.
Love it. Right. Well, I don't want to keep you guys here all night. One or two more questions?
We can also have QA with Tim over beers, because there is a lot of beer over there.
Sounds good.
Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone. Really appreciate your time. You guys beat me to it. Thank you very much, guys. Thank you. It's great.
Yeah, so what
Chad's been so excited.